welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. I will discuss Delhi's edition dated 19th December with you today. Let's get started. Today's newspaper has in detail dealt with the Gujarat and the Himachal election results. Barring from the role of Election Commission, this news is of not much importance. We can straight away move on to page 7, where the news Odisha keen to translocate tigers from MP in February is important. Let's look into it. The news relates to the Satkosia Tiger Reserve, which is located in Odisha. The Odisha government has been able to relocate the people living in the core area of the Satkosia Tiger Reserve, thus creating the ideal conditions for the transfer of tigers from Madhya Pradesh. The Tiger Reserve also aims to translocate more tigers from Maharashtra in 2019. This news is very important from prelims perspective as it covers three areas: tiger reserves, the National Tiger Conservation Authority or the NTCA, and of course the Project Tiger. Let us quickly look into them. To overcome the dwindling population of tigers in India, the Project Tiger, a centrally sponsored scheme, was launched in 1973. Under this project, tiger reserves were notified across India. Initially, just 9 tiger reserves were declared. However, today, India has 50 tiger reserves spanning over 18 states. It is important to note that these tiger reserves are notified by the state government on the recommendation of the National Tiger Conservation Authority. The National Tiger Conservation Authority is a statutory body under the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. Further, it had its enabling provisions from the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Through the Amendment Act of 2006, the National Tiger Conservation Authority was formed. It is interesting to note that an already notified tiger reserve cannot be denotified without the prior permission of NTCA. The only aspect that is left is of the tiger reserves. Like any national park or wildlife sanctuary, a tiger reserve is a protected area which comprises of two parts, the core area and the buffer zone. While the core areas have the legal status of a national park and hence severe measures can be taken for the protection of tigers, the buffer zone is a mix of forest and non-forest land and hence has a lower protection. The Satkosia Tiger Reserve has recently vacated the core area of its area. Tiger reserves, NTCA, Project Tiger, and the location of the Satkosia Tiger Reserve is very important from prelims perspective. Let's move on. Next we come to page 8 where the editorial Win Without the Shine, the articles How Gujarat Was Won and No Surprise in the Hills deal with the political aspects and hence we'll avoid. The article that we look into next is Speedy Decisive. The editorial talks about two aspects. First, speedy trial, and second, awarding of death sentence. Recently, trial courts in two separate cases awarded death penalty in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. While the first case relates to honor killing, where a Dalit youth was murdered by parents and other hired goons of the intermediate caste girl, the other case relates to the rape and murder of a Dalit law student. Both the crimes took place in early 2016 and thus the trial courts have done a commendable job by delivering justice speedily. This was also observed in other cases like the Nirbhaya case, the Shakti Mills gang rape, or the Delhi taxi driver case. Delivering justice in such a timely manner develops trust in the system. However, an issue that emerges from such delivery is that of the death sentence. Awarding death sentences by trial courts is a worrying trend, as these trial courts seem to be working under the pressure of the society. As these cases enrage the public sentiment, the trial courts seem to be awarding the highest punishment. When these cases are considered by the High Court, it is expected to have a balanced view. The editorial is important from the main's perspective as it gives important insights for paper 2 in the governance section. Let's move on. We come to page 9 where the article Hidden Figures of Indian Science deals with the problems of research in India. The article has pointed out the various reasons of the underperformance of Indian scientists. Some of the major reasons are scientists in India today prefer local awards instead of global competition. Further, the systems today are run by scientists turned bureaucrats. This has led to loyalty and yes-manship being rewarded over hard work. Moreover, a very small number of elite institutions get more funding than universities. Another major problem is most of the outstanding work is limited to theoretical research. This is a result of a poor scientific collaboration in India. These problems explain why Indian scientists perform exceptionally well in the developed countries. There is a need to reform the system, for which the first step would be to celebrate and acknowledge the neglected scientific accomplishments. The article is important for paper 3 India's scientific contributions in the mains examination. Next, we will look into for a safe cyberspace. This article relates to cybersecurity. We all are familiar that today's world is heavily dependent on computers. These computers are interconnected to form networks. As each and every domain of our lives gets dependent on these networks, the security of such networks becomes very important. By cybersecurity means the protection and defense of computer networks or systems from external threats that may damage the computer's hardware, software, or in general steal information. When it comes to India, our country has become a key player as it controls 50% of world's share of outsourcing. Further, various initiatives like the Aadhaar, BharatNet, MyGov, Startup India, and others signal India's shift towards a digital economy. Moreover, India has become the third largest hub for technologically driven startups. However, these initiatives and achievements come with a challenge, as India has become one of the most vulnerable countries to cybersecurity attacks. India has recorded more than 27,000 cases of cybersecurity attacks till June 2017. The International Telecommunication Union, which recently released its second Global Cybersecurity Index, has ranked India at the 23rd rank out of 165 countries, indicating that India is comparatively well prepared on the global level to fight cybersecurity threats. If you have followed the news carefully, in the recent months, you must have come across the word ransomware. Ransomware is one of the most common cybersecurity threats today. To understand ransomware, let us consider an example. Let's assume that I am using a computer and I somehow download a file. This file then blocks the computer and asks me for money. Unless and until I pay the money, the file or the software would not unblock the computer, thus disallowing me from using it further. In this scenario, the file or the software that I downloaded is called a ransomware. Some of the most prominent ransomwares are the WannaCry and Petya. The problem with such ransomwares is that they attack cross-platform. This means be it Android or Windows or Mac, a ransomware or any other such software can attack any of these platforms. With such softwares and ransomwares affecting networks across the world, an obvious question is what can India do in such a scenario? First, India needs to frame and implement a comprehensive and robust cybersecurity policy. For this, it would need to create the adequate infrastructure. There is a need to establish international collaboration and cooperation when it comes to cybersecurity. Brands and firms like Zomato and Uber have already been affected by cybersecurity threats that led to theft of personal data. In such a scenario, there is a need for a global convention or a treaty that is necessary to keep the internet free and open as we know it today. A recent welcome decision by the government is the grant of 5 crore rupees to startups innovating in the field of cybersecurity. The article is very important from prelims and mains perspective. When it comes to prelims, a question may be formed on the definition of cybersecurity itself. An MCQ may also be expected from the Cyber Security Index that is published by the International Telecommunication Union. Another important fact to remember is that ITU is headquartered at Geneva. The definition of ransomware and the way it affects the computers is also important. When it comes to mains, these suggestions can come handy when writing an answer on cybersecurity. One last thing to remember regarding cybersecurity in India is that the Computer Emergency Response Team is the national nodal agency for cybersecurity in India. Let's move on. Next, we'll look into the article titled The Urban Heat Island Effect. Like the name suggests, the article talks about the urban heat island effect. Let us first understand what this effect is. Let us assume that this surface is a plain earth surface and this is the sun. Sunlight in the form of radiations fall on the surface and reflect. The surface absorbs some amount of radiation which we feel as the warm or hot surface. The rest of the radiation that is not absorbed is reflected. Let us make some changes on the surface now. In the quest for development, the plain surface was replaced by concrete roads, buildings, small houses, hotels, and others. This is a typical scene of a city that we also call as urban areas. Now, we all know that certain surfaces tend to absorb more heat like concrete and other construction materials. So, in this case, when the radiation from the sun falls on such surface, there is an increase in the absorbed heat. Further, while our plane surface had only one surface to absorb the heat, in urban areas, because of buildings, we have increased number of surfaces for absorption. So instead of one, now we have three. This increased absorption of heat leads to a rise in urban temperature. This rise in temperature creates a dome around the city where the temperature is more than the surrounding temperature. This effect is called the urban heat island effect. Let us look into the consequences of this effect. The first consequence is the nighttime temperature of the city remains high. Cities suffering from urban heat island effect tend to have a lower air quality as most of the pollutants tend to get trapped. The next consequence is the lowering water quality as the water that runs through the city becomes warmer, which in a later stage when mixing with the water bodies tends to increase their temperature. Another effect associated with the urban heat island effect is the global warming. As the temperature increases, the residents of a city tend to use air conditioners or fans, which in turn are powered by energy that leads to the emission of global warming gases like carbon dioxide and methane. Moving on to the article, a study states that Many cities in India are experiencing the urban heat island effect. Case in point is Bhubaneswar, which recorded an increase of 1.8 degrees Celsius due to the UHI. Similarly, Delhi has recorded 4 to 12 degrees warmer temperature due to the effect. The urban heat island effect is important from the prelims perspective. A question can also be formed on the consequences of the effect. Let's move on. The next news that we will discuss is focus on income mobility. The central theme of this article is income inequality. Recently, the World Inequality Lab released the World Inequality Report. The report has observed that in India, income inequality has increased since the economic liberalization. We all are familiar that India opened up its economy in 1991. Another interesting fact that the report observed is that before 1991, when India was under socialist policies, the inequality had decreased. Soon after the report was unveiled, many scholars have been proposing that to reduce the income inequality in India, we should tax the rich more. However, the article has countered this popular view. Let us understand this with an example. The popular view states that the rich must be taxed. When the rich is taxed, the government will take over some of its money and then would redistribute this money to the poor. However, the article states, though it is true that the rich and the middle class control more resources and have higher incomes, it may not be correct to assume that the poor will benefit from taxing the rich. The article has stated several reasons why taxing the rich and redistributing the money to the poor may not reduce inequality. The producers of the goods consumed by the rich would have lesser incentives to perform well. Further, the workers would not prefer high skilled jobs as they would be taxed more. Another problem with the model is that the investors would not want to invest their money in newer projects because of high tax on their profits. These problems, especially that of the investors, was faced by India before the economic liberalization. Hence, in the quest to reduce income inequality, taxing the rich and redistributing to the poor may not be the best way out. To solve this problem, the article has proposed income mobility. Simply put, income mobility means that a person with lower income can, with the help of performance, climb the ladder and move on to higher income. Thus, in a market economy, which India aspires to become, there are no legal barriers. This means inequality will always remain, but the poor or the rich would be decided solely based on the performance. Thus, everyone can climb the economic ladder and become rich. At the same time, if someone fails to perform, he can move down the ladder. Thus, rather than taxing the rich, India must strive to provide equal opportunity to everyone so that everyone can choose a high income profession, and this can only be achieved by providing better education and healthcare. The article is important from both prelims and mains perspective as it presents an alternative view to address the problem of income inequality. An MCQ may also be formed on the World Inequality Report 2018. Let's move on. We come to page 12 where we will look into US vetoes UN call on Jerusalem's status. The news relates to the earlier action by the US to shift its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the de facto capital of Israel. We have dealt with the Jerusalem issue in our earlier DNS. So we'll focus more on the UNSC vote. UNSC, or the United Nations Security Council, is a principal organ of the United Nations that has 15 members. Out of these 15 members, 5 are permanent, while the rest 10 are non-permanent members that have a term of 2 years. Interestingly, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are China, Russia, US, United Kingdom, and France. It is important to note that currently India is not a member of UN Security Council. Each permanent member of the council has what they call a veto. Like in the Indian Parliament, security councils also deal with resolutions that can be introduced by any member. To pass a resolution, the council requires 9 out of the 15 votes. Here are where the things get interesting. Out of the remaining 6 votes, if any vote which is negative and of a permanent member, it would be considered as a veto. Every resolution that is vetoed cannot be passed. It is very important to note a permanent member may choose to abstain, which means not vote at all. In such a scenario, veto is not applied. Now that we know a bit about United Nations Security Council, we can better understand the news. As we have seen earlier, the US had made a decision to shift its embassy to Jerusalem. This saw opposition from many countries. Consequently, Egypt drafted a resolution in the council that called upon countries to refrain from diplomatic relations with Jerusalem. When it was put to vote, 14 members out of the 15 voted in favor of the resolution. However, USA used its veto, which led to the end of the resolution. It is interesting to note US has used its veto after a gap of almost 6 years. The obvious question would be, what would have happened if the resolution was passed? The resolution would have been a symbolic gesture, but the council does not have the power to dictate US to stop its shift of its embassy to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem issue has been in news for quite some time now, and hence we must keep ourselves updated with the issue. We have discussed the most important points of the UN Security Council, which can be asked in the prelims examination. With this, we come to an end to today's newspaper. Let's move on to the question for today.